Hi everyone, it's Alex, and today I'm here with a very belated wrap-up video. I have not filmed an actual real, sit down in front of my bookshelves and film video in months. Almost a year. I think the last one I filmed was last summer, maybe August. I'm not really entirely certain, but it was a minute ago. So I kind of figured I would start with something that was a little bit less effort involved than filming the book haul that I have to film, which has over 100 books. So I decided to start with a nice belated wrap-up video. This is for July of 2020, so hitting right about exactly a year behind there, which is lovely. But I kind of decided that I did want to actually go back and film all of those old videos because I do have a log of all the books I read. I'm not currently up to date on my Goodreads reviews, but I am up through November, so I have a good few months before that starts being a problem. But I do have all the books that I read, and I do want to talk about all of them. Now, being as how this is kind of belated and all of that, I'm not entirely certain how good my memory is on this. I have Goodreads reviews. I'll be referring to them pretty closely. Maybe word for word sometimes. We'll see. Just depending on what I remember. Obviously, the better or worse a book was, the more I'll remember it. A lot of the 3 stars kind of just went in and out, but I did just want to go back and talk about all these books because there are some books that I feel like deserve to be talked about, like books that I really enjoyed or that were really worthwhile, that I never got a chance to talk about because I haven't been so active on BookTube. So I just want to go back and go through all my old wrap-ups and then hopefully eventually get caught up to current day. So it'll probably be a while before there's a current wrap-up. So I'll just get into it. I have 7 books that I read in July of last year. So let's just start talking about them. I also don't have any of these books anymore. I'm pretty sure they were all either library books or ebooks, so I'll just be inserting the picture over here. The first book that I read was The Wasp Factory by Iain Banks. I gave this 2 stars. This is an adult contemporary fiction novel about things. I don't remember this book anymore. I'm pretty sure this is one of those books I repressed, so if I'm looking down, it's because I'm looking at Goodreads, and I'm looking at my review of the things I wrote because I don't know what to say anymore. Frank is a 16-year-old boy who lives with his father. His older brother is confined to a psychiatric hospital, and Frank is... he's like a psychopath. He likes to murder things. That's all I remember. That's all Goodreads gave me too, so that's all that's really important. It's about this 16-year-old boy who likes to kill things and has an abusive relationship with his father, I believe. Okay, so that's what the book is about that I remember. I did like the writing style. I gave it 2 stars and it was a year ago, so I don't remember it that well. I did like the writing style. I thought, the sentence construction and word choice was very interesting, and, I enjoyed his actual style of writing if I could, forget about the subject of the book. So that kind of leaves me inclined to try more of his other books if they have, because I have heard his other books are good and might be more to my taste anyway. So the fact that I did enjoy his writing style kind of leads me to believe that I might actually really like some of his other books, just not this one. Things I didn't like. I think that was the only real positive I had. I said I liked Eric. Eric was the older brother. I don't really remember much about Eric, so not gonna get into that one. I wrote 7 paragraphs for this review, so I don't really know. There's a lot of animal abuse. that was a big thing for me in this book. And it's not that I'm animal abuse is bad, so it shouldn't be in a book. It was more just, I find it really unpleasant to read, and not in an interesting way. It's just, I don't enjoy reading about animal abuse, and there was a lot of it in this book. Just a lot. It's kind of the main point of the book, kind of. So that was rough for me. I should have just stopped reading it at one point because there was this whole weird bunny massacre that was super unpleasant, and I don't know. I should have just stopped reading it and I didn't. But yeah, there was lots of animal abuse that I don't like reading about. So if you don't like animal abuse, this is not the book for you. Other things I didn't like that might actually be related to the story. Oh, I found the main character really boring. He was a psychopath, but like maybe question mark. And there are a lot of like weird things, and that was kind of all his character was. He was just a psychopath who liked killing things, but also might not have been a psychopath. We'll see. It was strange, it was odd, I wasn't a fan. I found him just he was just kind of unpleasant to read about and not interesting. Like you could have a character who does a lot of bad things and they're interesting and I'm down with that. But when they're just such an unpleasant person and they're boring, it makes the whole book unpleasant. And then there was a twist ending, which I actually do remember. I'm not having to look at my computer in my review for this one. The whole twist ending, I found, what's the word? I don't want to say problematic, 'cause that's way too vague. It was odd. That's even more vague. I don't really know how to discuss it without giving away spoilers, because it does kind of ruin the book in a way, because the twist ending is kind of like the big twist, the big reveal, and yeah, I don't know, but it felt very tacked on. Like it didn't have anything to do with the rest of the book, and it was all just very like unpleasant. I don't know. Like that's just the word I keep going back to for this book. I just found the experience incredibly unpleasant. Yeah, and it was also just like really sexist as well throughout the whole book, and it was I was not a fan. I do want to read more Iain Banks just because I have heard that like some of his other books are much more interesting and better, and possibly have less animal abuse, which would be ideal. But yeah, this was kind of not a great read for me. And then I read Goodbye from Nowhere by Sara Zarr. I gave this 3 stars. I was kind of making my way through Sara Zarr's books last year. She writes young adult contemporary novels that tend to be very like realistic and focused on like small dramas in people's lives rather than being like big and over the top and kind of like huge romancy things. It's kind of just like these feel like real people in real situations, which is why I like her. This book I just didn't connect to on like the story itself, and I feel like that with a lot of Sara Zarr's books, which is unfortunate because I love her writing style and I love the stories that she chooses to tell, or the kinds of stories she chooses to tell. I just don't wind up liking the actual stories themselves, and not because they're like I think they're bad, they just don't really jive with me. This was about a teenage boy who finds out his mother's having an affair, and he kind of has this idealized notion of his life, and it kind of finding out about his mother's affair kind of just shatters that. He's a very like idealistic person in the beginning, and he's always like very optimistic. He's so happy, he looks on the happy side of things, and I might have just been too much of a cynic for that, because it was a little bit like his whole world crashes down around him because he finds out about his mother's affair. Like he quits his baseball team, he like kind of dumps his girlfriend, he avoids all his friends, like he doesn't do anything. He just kind of shuts down and avoids people. And it's a little bit like, I don't know, it seemed like, for me as a cynic, it just seemed like way too much of an overreaction for how I would feel, and I know that characters are different, but it kind of felt a little bit unrelatable to me. Just, I don't know. I think I'm just too much of a cynic for a story like that, and maybe like as a teenager I would understand a little more, but I don't know. I didn't really love that. For me, there's a difference between like finding out something negative and having that affect your worldview in like a realistic way, and then just going all out and destroying every aspect of your life, like the main character in this book did. And he was also just kind of boring and kind of like not the greatest of people. Like he kind of treated a lot of people badly throughout the book, which was like kind of the point, but also he just came across as very insensitive and boring, and I was kind of bored by the story, so I kind of just checked out and didn't really feel a whole lot about this book. But it was like inoffensive, which I don't know, that might be almost kind of worse in a way. At least if it was offensive, I'd remember anything about this book, but I don't. The one positive thing I do have to say, well, I mean, apart from the general positives of Sara Zarr that I always say, I love her writing style, I love her settings, I love the way she develops her stories. I think she's a great author. She just frequently chooses to tell stories that I'm not specifically interested in, but there was Arrow Ace rep in this book, which I really enjoyed, because I still don't see a whole lot of that, and it wasn't like the main focus of the story, but it was there, which was nice to see. This just, I don't know, it wasn't a particularly great book by my standards. Then I read A Certain October by Angela Johnson, which I also gave 3 stars. This is a young adult contemporary novel about a girl named Scotty who was involved in a train accident. It killed someone that she knew, she wasn't that close with, but like someone she went to school with, and it put her younger brother in the hospital. And by involved with, I mean she was on the train, not that she like caused the accident or anything. This book I just have the hardest time talking about, and I had the hardest time talking about it at the time I read it as well. This isn't just a case of distance. This book took me weeks to read. Just like, I spent at least a month, maybe longer, reading this book. And it's only about 170 pages. I just didn't comprehend it. And I don't mean like I couldn't understand what happened, because it was a young adult novel. It's not like it went over my head or anything. It was just like, there was a disconnect that I was just not seeing this book, or what was worthwhile about this book, or anything about it. It was just like, it didn't exist as a story to me. It didn't feel like a story to my brain. And I'm not saying that because it was bad. There was just some strange disconnect that I think it might have just been my mood at the time that absolutely wrecked this for me. But yeah, it was strange. I felt like I kept waiting for something about this book to like grab me or appeal to me or be like, oh, now I get it, or now I'm invested in something in this story. And I was kind of feeling that way right up until like the final pages, where I still just did not really understand what the point was or like the purpose of this book. It just felt like there were so many different things going on. She was sad about the train accident. Her best friend was like possibly going to a dance with this guy, and she might have been going to a dance with a guy, I don't remember. Or like her other friend was like going through a breakup, and like they were trying to get him back together with his ex, and I don't know, there was just like weird things going on that it didn't like come together and form a whole story for me. Usually I like short books. I even like just prefer them to longer books in general, because I feel like authors tend to just talk too much and unnecessarily. But this book, it kind of felt like Johnson was just cramming this 300-page story into a book half its length, and it needed more time to develop. Like I just couldn't grasp like the point of the story that I was reading, and that's usually not a problem for me, even when I don't like the book. This just, I don't know, there was something about this that went over my head, so I feel bad reviewing it or saying anything negative, because it's not like I thought the characters were poorly crafted, it's just that like I couldn't comprehend them. I'm not sure. That sounds weird, even to me, but like, I don't know how else to describe it. This book was just like beyond me in some way, and I think it was just that I read so little of it over so long, and then by the time I finished it, I just still was not like grasping the story itself. So then I read Finding Yvonne by Brandy Colbert, which I gave 4 stars because I did enjoy this one quite a bit. This I do remember. I don't have to just like read the Goodreads description in order to tell you anything about it. But Yvonne is a teenager who is kind of just struggling with who she is as a person. For much of her life, she's been a violinist. She's trained as a violinist, and then she kind of hits like 16, 17, and her teacher tells her that she's not good enough to be professional or like top tier or whatever, and she quits. Her father is a very well-known chef, and her boyfriend is also like an up-and-coming great chef, and she feels like they have their passions and she's kind of missing hers, because she's always had the violin and now she doesn't. So this book is just about her like finding herself and trying to figure out what like her one thing is, like the thing that she cares about. And while she's like searching for that, she meets a boy who's not her boyfriend, who's also a musician, and she kind of bonds with him over music, and then she also becomes pregnant, and that is kind of like this whole other slew of problems, and it's just like a really nice coming of age story that I would overall really recommend, because it's been a year and I still honestly remember it fairly well. I liked Yvonne's character, and when I say I liked her character, I didn't always like her as a person or agree with her decisions, but she always felt really like fleshed out to me, and it was like I understood where she was coming from, even when I felt like she was making the wrong decision or doing something bad. And it was just, she was well crafted as a person with like flaws and everything, which I think sometimes authors like to write nice main characters who you always like agree with and support. And it was nice to see her as like not a villain or a bad person, but just like a regular person who made bad decisions sometimes, and I liked that. I also really enjoyed the portrayal of cheating in this, and I mean like kind of cheating light. Yvonne dates two different guys in this book at the same time, and she's not technically like monogamous with either of them, like they haven't agreed to be exclusive or anything, but it's still like she's still hiding it, so it's cheating light. I think a lot of times in books it's a very black and white situation, and in this it wasn't. Like, she's a kid, you know, at the end of the day she's a kid who's figuring out her life. She's only 17 and she's just trying to like figure out who she is, and sometimes along the way when teenagers are doing that, they treat other people badly. And this book really, it did so good at straddling the line of like not justifying the cheating, but like explaining it so that it's like you understand where she's coming from, and like you understand the situation even if you don't agree with it. And I think that's a really hard thing to portray in books, and I really did enjoy that because it was very much just like, this is a girl, this is her life, these are like the bad decisions that she makes sometimes, and she's a person who does bad things sometimes, and she's just normal. She's not trying to like treat people bad, she just happens to. And it was interesting. It was an interesting discussion, and that's what I really enjoy. One of the things that I did kind of have a problem with is her relationship with her boyfriend. Not like the second guy she meets, but like her initial boyfriend. She's 17 in high school in this book, and it's kind of implied that she's been with her boyfriend for a minute and she's known him at least a couple of years. And he's 21, and the age gap was discussed, and it was kind of handled about as well as it could be, but it was still, it made me uncomfortable. It was just a little bit much for like this literal high school student who's just going to school every day, taking classes, living with her father, to be dating this dude who has a full-time job, who has his own apartment, and she's just hanging out with his apartment and staying the night. And it just made me uncomfortable in a way that wasn't super relevant to the story. Like, he could have easily been like a 19-year-old instead of a 21-year-old, or like living with his parents, or like kind of less of an adult, like just slightly less of an adult, and it wouldn't have changed anything about the story. And it was one of those things that I just felt it was kind of distracting from the story. Like, it wasn't the worst thing, and it was handled within the book. It was discussed. It was, like, delicately handled, I guess you could say. But it still just, it felt like it was unnecessary to the story itself, and it just distracted me from the important things that were going on in the book. Whereas that was just kind of, like, this very secondary thing that wasn't supposed to matter. And because he was so much older and so much more of an adult than she was, it was kind of like it was taking away the focus from where your attention was supposed to be. But beyond that, it was like a really good book. And if you like young adult contemporaries like this, I would recommend picking it up. Then I read Old Man's War by John Scalzi. This is an adult science fiction novel about basically the military recruits old people on Earth to come and join their army and fight against aliens. And it basically makes the old people young again and gives them like a second chance at life. It's interesting. It's fun. I gave this book 4 stars, and I really, really enjoyed it. Because at the end of the day, this was just like a really fun book. Which is a little bit weird to me, because I don't tend towards sci-fi, and especially like military-focused sci-fi. But I enjoyed this so much. It is a whole series, and I kind of opted not to read the whole series, not out of a lack of enjoyment, but just because this felt like such a good contained story that I'm almost worried about like expanding it and making me enjoy it less so in the process. So I just kind of decided to read this as a standalone, but it was really, really worthwhile. My biggest problem was honestly just that it was so lighthearted, because I don't tend to get along with super fluffy books, and not that this was fluffy. There was a lot of gravitas and a lot of like sadness to it. The man has lost his wife, the main character who decides to join the military and get a second chance at life, has lost his wife. She passed away, and it's very sad. Like, the opening was just like kind of heartbreaking, but the main focus is the humor and the fun and the fact that it's an enjoyable ride. And for me, that's kind of like, okay, I can really enjoy this book, but I can't absolutely love it, because I do need kind of something a little bit darker and a little bit more toned down than that to be like a true favorite. But it was so much fun. There were tons of interesting topics that were brought up and discussed in this book, just like the morality of the army overall, and if it was like okay what they were doing. Like, not just with recruiting the old people, but just the war itself and the fighting and what they were doing and like basically destroying these other alien species. Like, if that was, you know, a good moral thing to do, or if it was they were in the wrong. And it was really interesting. I almost kind of wanted a bit more of that, just because John Scalzi obviously has like a lot of really interesting ideas in that vein, and it was just like that was what drew me into the book more than anything else, was just that like they would discuss like what it means to take commands without question, or like what the de-aging process really means and like what's behind it, because no one joins this army before they're 75 years old, so they have to like become younger kind of. And it was just it was fascinating to read. I also loved how the science was handled, because there is a lot of science as it's like a military sci-fi book, and I definitely struggle with science in books a lot. But this was really well done, because it was like everything was kind of explained just enough that I could grasp the concept, or like what was kind of intended by it, even if I didn't understand the actual science itself or pseudoscience or whatever. I could follow what he was trying to convey in at least the vague terms, which is all you need, and it was kind of written like that. There were a couple of sections that were like especially science heavy that I skimmed, but they weren't super relevant to the story itself. It was just kind of like a little bit of extra background information on this, but Scalzi definitely did a really good job of just like explaining the science, even so someone who's like as science illiterate as I am could just follow along with the basic concepts he was getting at. I loved all the characters. There were a lot of characters. I can't really remember or name any of them, but I did really, really like them all. They made for an interesting cast, and I almost wish I could see where they were going in the sequels, but I don't know. I just feel like that would be maybe a little bit disappointing for me. Or just like, this was such a good standalone, self-contained book that I don't want to open it up more. My only other main issue was just that it was a little bit fast-paced. I do like my books slower, and especially lighter, funnier books tend to be like a little bit quick for me, and this definitely fell into that. But even with that, it was so worthwhile and so much fun, and definitely like I'll be reading more John Scalzi in the future, because I definitely do think I'll enjoy more of his work, and I would highly recommend this if it sounds interesting to you. Then I read Anything But Okay by Sara Littman, and dear God, I hated this book. I gave this 2 stars. This is a young adult contemporary novel about a girl whose older brother just got home from Afghanistan, and her best friend is Middle Eastern. I don't remember what her nationality was, but she was Middle Eastern. And it's basically about how her brother got into a fight with one of her classmates, like a physical, like he got into a fist fight and then got arrested. And sort of the media gets involved, and it's all like blown out of control, and her best friend suffers hate crimes as a result, and it was a lot. I thought it was going to be like interesting and issue driven, and it was just preachy. Like, dear God, it was preachy. I don't think I've ever read anything that was as preachy as this book. It wasn't a literal sermon. It was a lot. It could have just told a story without having to shove its message down my throat, you know? And even like a message I agreed with, because I wasn't disagreeing with anything Littman said here, because it was all just about like basically tolerance and acceptance, and you know, racism is bad was like the main point. And it's like I'm obviously on that side, and I'm not being like, oh well, I disagree with like the essence of the preachiness. It's just that I don't like the preachiness itself. It's not what she's preaching, it's just that I'm not reading a novel to be preached to. Like, you can have messages in your book and have it be interesting and have lots of discussions about these things, but this book wasn't discussing anything. It was just preaching constantly, incessantly, and it was so unpleasant. And it was just like, maybe I would understand this if it was written for a much younger audience, where it was like, oh yes, we're teaching you a message and we have to be very explicit about that message, because it's like intended for 6-year-olds, and like they won't grasp the nuance. But it's like meant for teenagers, and like it's definitely in the older range of YA, I felt. But it was just like the characterization and development of the actual story were just so secondary to the message. Like, it was all about like Islamophobia and racism and like how bad that is, and it's like, I get it, Like, I don't need to be constantly told that Islamophobia is bad. Just tell me a story. And the story can include how Islamophobia is bad, but like, the story can't be Islamophobia is bad. End of sentence. Like, that's not a story. That's, a statement. If you want to write a nonfiction book about it, sure, that's different. But like, not a novel. The one specific thing I did mention in my review, which I'm going to try to say in a delicate way, kind of, or at least like not word it horribly. I don't know what I'm talking about here. I read this book a year ago. Stella's best friend, Farida, I'm not entirely certain how you pronounce that name. I'm too tired to Google things because my camera is running out of battery. Farida is, I say in this review, an Iraqi American who also happens to be Muslim. I don't remember, but that's what I said. Her entire role in this book, like her entire character, is to exist solely to call out Stella for her white privilege. That is, her name's Stella, right? I've said that like 4 times. Yes. I've said that like 4 times in this review and I've still forgotten. That's all she does. And I don't mind that she does it, because it's like, that can be a very interesting thing. It creates an interesting dynamic in their friendship. Like, it's an important thing. Not just to do in real life, but like, to portray in books, to like, normalize it. But that was her entire character. I can't tell you a single thing about her character that wasn't specifically related to her calling out Stella for white privilege. And it was constant. And it was like, I understood it in certain situations. Like, be watching a movie, an old movie, and Stella would be like, oh, this is great. And Frida would be like, oh, but like, the racism, like, literally everyone in this movie is white. Like, that's kind of a problem, and it makes me uncomfortable watching it. And you don't notice that. It's like, that's very understandable. That's like a conversation you have with your best friend. But then it just got so much, like, in ways that like didn't make sense. Like, Stella's brother was going to jail. He'd been arrested. He has really bad PTSD. The media is calling him out by name. The governor, or the candidate for governor, I can't remember, was specifically pushing for him to have a really long jail sentence and make an example out of him. People were vandalizing Stella's house, and Frida was still like, this is your white privilege speaking. Even when like Stella was going through like actual, real, very serious things, Farida made it all about her constantly and never offered like any sympathy. Like, it can be like, oh hey, you're understanding some of what I go through as well. Like, this is things I experience too. I'm so sorry for you. Like, express sympathy or concern or care or understanding. And like, there was none of that. Like, Frida just like refused to speak to her for most of the book. Even when what Stella was going through was just like really, really horrible. And it didn't make sense. And she was just such a tokenized character. And the author is also white. Otherwise I might be like a little bit quieter or less harsh on that. But like, it was just so poorly done in every aspect. Like, you have to make, like, it's fine that she's calling her friend out for white privilege or racism or whatever, but that was literally the only thing she did throughout this entire book. And it was a lot. It was so preachy and so like heavy-handed with everything it was doing. It was such an unpleasant book. Like, it was definitely one of those books that if I remember the author's name when I'm looking at random books on a shelf, I will avoid. But that's contingent on me remembering the author's name, and I don't know that this book really stood out to me that much for me to do that in the future. And then the final thing I listened to an audiobook was Roomies by Sara Zarr and Altebrando. This was a reread for me. I gave it 4 stars. I didn't love it quite as much upon reread as I did the first time I read it, which was like years and years ago. So I think that was just like me growing up with age. I noticed some of the flaws. This is a young adult contemporary. I gave it 4 stars. It's told in dual perspective about 2 very different girls who are going to college, and they find out they're going to become roomies. One of them lives in San Francisco and is basically just moving across the city to go to school, and then one of them is from the East Coast and is moving all the way across the country to go to school in San Francisco. And they're very different people. It's basically just about like their last summers before college, and they're like emailing or writing letters to each other to try to kind of get to know each other and figure out who each other is and how they're going to coexist in the same dorm. And it's nice. I like it. I like it a lot. It really captures pre-college life so well. Just like I'm packing up, I'm leaving my family, like what does this mean? Like what kind of relationship do I have with my family now, and like how is that going to be affected by me going away and living at school for most of the year? And it was really interesting. I definitely do like Sarah Zarr's portion of the book more than Tara Altebrando's. I love Sarah Zarr's writing style. Tara Altebrando's kind of okay. I'm not the biggest fan of her. This is definitely a book that I read for Sarah Zarr specifically, and I did enjoy that. One thing I liked was that with dual narrators, they sometimes sound the same, and I feel like I could turn to literally any page of this book, read 3 sentences, and know exactly who was speaking. Like, the two characters were just so different, and like, sounded so different, and had such different personalities that like, I don't think you could ever mistake them for each other. And it was just, it's really well done, and I think it is like, part of it is like 2 different writers with 2 different styles and personalities of their own, but it is just like they mesh really well together in the same story, but they just have such strong, distinct voices. At times it was a little bit like melodramatic, like not hugely so, and it still has that like very down-to-earth vibe that Sarah Zarr has, but it kind of just felt like it could have been toned down just like a little bit throughout. And I don't know if that was Tara Altebrando's influence. I'm kind of inclined to blame her just because I've read some of her solo books and I wasn't really a fan, but it just, a lot of it was very down to earth, and then sometimes they would just have like really big fights or like secret affairs or like kind of like very melodramatic things, and it was just like, it could have taken a breath without losing any of the story, and I didn't super love that. And then it tried to have discussions about race, and every time it did, it made me cringe. I don't think it was handled well at all. Both the characters and both the authors are white, but one of the main characters starts dating this black guy, and so my camera actually did die there, and I kind of forgot what I was talking about, but I'm pretty sure I was near the end. Roomies, the race thing, they tried to handle it, which, you know, is nice, but it just felt like every time it was brought up, they were so out of touch and had no idea what they were talking about. So it was kind of cringy and poorly done. But it wasn't, overall, the book's a decent one. If you're looking for something that's like kind of college-centric, I would recommend it, because I know it can be hard to find books that are about college, and while they're not technically at college, most of it is like centered around them going to college, and college plays a really big role in the story. So yeah, I would recommend that one. I kind of wish I loved it as much as I did the first time, but it's still a really good, really well-written book. So that was everything that I read in July. This has been a great deal of time spent filming, but I'm not entirely certain how much of that was me like talking and saying actual things about the book versus me just like kind of reading off of Goodreads or staring into space or trying to figure out what to say. It's been a minute since I filmed. This feels weird and uncomfortable and awkward. I'm sure I will get back into the swing of things soon. Hopefully continue filming these wrap-ups until I'm caught up. We'll see how that goes. I'm not putting any pressure on myself, so it might be a while before we get the next one, but it'll happen eventually, hopefully. Let me know down below if you've read any of these books, and as always, thank you so much for watching, and I will see y'all again soon.